So is anybody, just a general question. Last time we had about 67 students present, I think, roughly. Is that roughly the strength that is in other classes, or are we missing people? Any idea about that?
I think it's almost roughly the same. It's like plus or minus 5, maybe.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Yeah, in any case, I'm glad that you have all joined us at CMI. I know it's a peculiar way to go to college, but there are some, we may find some good aspects to this arrangement as well. So just to I'll probably be preparing a list of problems for you to look at after this class. So I will share that with you. I think I will put it up on the website. Some lecture notes from last time are also available there. A list of books has also been prepared. So you can certainly look at those things. Yeah, and do let me know if there is some aspect that is not working well. Okay, I see Vishnu Kadiri here, I think. So let me do something about that. What should we do to get recording of a class? You have done what you need to do, that is to ask me. Yeah, let me see if now are there people present here who were not present last time? Yeah, so I mean, if I'm able, I will provide a recording. Though, as I said last time, you do need to be present at the lectures and discussions so that you can benefit from that. You can't count on the class being recorded and provided to you separately. The lecture notes have been made available, so that should be a useful resource, I hope. So I see that Vishnu Kadiri is also here. He will be another TA, as is Shubhendu Prasad Mandal. Both of them are with us today. So I request both of them to admit. Okay, let me see. You are not yet a co-host. I will try that again. Oh, cease to be a co-host. So sad. There are so many names here that I have to scroll through this long list to find you. Okay, and
sir, actually I joined through my laptop, so I joined initially through my mobile. So.
Okay, I understand. Fine. So I've made you a co-host. I hope that goes through again. Yeah. And just so I know, where are you, Shubhendu?
Sir, I'm in Kolkata.
Kolkata. Okay, fine. And Vishnu, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm currently in CMI, sir.
Okay, fine, great. So we have 54 participants, which means 51 students. Yeah. So may I know, okay, somebody asked, Akash Yadav asked about what we should do to get a recording of a class. Yeah, okay, how do you feel it will be useful to you? Could you tell me that?
Sir, I just feel that I'll be like watching the recordings again after the class.
Okay, were you present at the last class?
Yes, sir, I was present.
Okay, fine. So, okay, I will bear your request in mind and see what I can do about that. Yeah. Though I emphasize that it is no substitute for presence. But I do appreciate your interest in viewing the lecture subsequently. It can be useful. And there are things in the lecture that are not in the notes, including mistakes and interesting anecdotes and so on. Yeah, so we've reached 11:53 a.m. So I hope we can have everybody's presence soon. So just to recapitulate, last class, that is on Tuesday, the 21st of September 2021, we introduced some basic properties of vectors in three-dimensional Euclidean space and two-dimensional Euclidean space. In particular, they have a length and a direction, that one can define a dot product. A dot B is AB cosine of the angle between the two, and that the dot product actually encodes a lot of information about angles and lengths of vectors, and concepts of orthogonality as well as parallelism. So two vectors are orthogonal if their dot product satisfies what property? Please tell me.
They are zero. It's zero.
Correct. And two vectors. Very good. Yeah. So if two vectors are point in the same direction, then that two is visible in the dot product. How would it be visible?
Their
Their dot
magnitude
product
multiplied.
Okay, yeah, it's the product of their yes, their lengths, of course, up to a sign, because they may be in the same direction or anti-parallel, parallel or anti-parallel. Yes, but yes, the main message was that the dot product encodes a lot of geometry. And more generally, the angle between vectors was also encoded. In fact, the cosine of the angle is equal to the quotient of the dot product and the product of the lengths. Yeah, so okay, so let me now share my screen. Let us hope this works. We have 62 participants, which means about 59%. Okay, yeah. So I want to, any other questions at this stage before we go on? Okay, I just want to clarify one thing from last time, which I was a bit cavalier about and perhaps misspoke or confused. So we've got two concepts here. If you've got a vector B and another vector A, a vector B and a vector A, you can speak about the component of B in the direction of A. Now, that's purely a real number. It's not a vector. It's a real number that could be positive, it could be negative. And that's defined as simply B cosine theta, where theta is the angle between the two vectors. And it's also expressible as B dotted with the unit vector in the A direction. So that's the component of B in the A direction. It's a real number. It can be positive, negative, or even 0. So when is the component of B in the direction of A 0? Please tell me.
It is 90.
When
Correct.
it's perpendicular to it.
Very good. Yeah. When A and B are perpendicular, 90-degree angle, then there's no component. It's 0. Fine. So this is the idea of a component. It's a very useful idea. Now we have another related idea called the projection or orthogonal projection of a vector on another vector. So here we will denote it. I did not introduce this notation last time, but I realized I should have. So P A hat of B. So P A hat is a gadget. It's a gadget that takes a vector B and spits out another vector, namely its orthogonal projection. Now that orthogonal projection is a vector, unlike a component, which is just a scalar. So the orthogonal projection of B is a vector. It's a vector that points in the direction of A. So when I say in the direction of A, I don't mean, it could be also in the opposite to the direction of A. Yeah, those are, sometimes I don't make the distinction. And it has a coefficient. So PA of B is B cosine theta, namely the component of B in the direction of A times A hat, all right? So that's the definition of the orthogonal projection. And this figure should make it clearer. Let's look at this figure. We've got vector A and we've got vector B. Now you've got the unit vector in the direction of A as well. Yeah. And we can compute B cosine theta. So that is some number. Now the projection is a vector in this case that points from the origin as usual up to this point where the perpendicular from the tip of B reaches the line through A. All right, so that's the orthogonal projection of B on A. Now this orthogonal projection could point in the other direction. So for instance, if this is A hat and this is my B vector, oops, I have moved things away. I need to go back. Oops, yeah. Yeah, let me do this again. So what I was saying is that if you have a vector A and you have another vector B, the projection of B on A in this case is going to point anti-parallel to A, right? So this PA hat of B is this vector. Yeah. So, but the main message is that the orthogonal projection is a vector. It has a length equal to the magnitude of the component of B in the direction of A. Okay. Any question about that? Okay. So let us move on. We did indicate a couple of examples, just actually one example of the use of dot product in physics, namely the computation of work. It's the dot product of force and the displacement. So we will say a lot more about that. So now after that, we introduced another type of product, namely the vector or cross product. So given a pair of vectors A and B, their cross product is a new vector A cross B with magnitude equal to the product of the magnitude times the sine of the angle between them as opposed to the cosine. All right. But since this is a vector, we need to say which way it points. And the message was that it points, A cross B points in a direction perpendicular to both A and B. All right. So that's the first message. Points in a direction perpendicular to both A and B. So these examples will show how it is. So if in this example, A cross B, A is roughly horizontal, B is towards the northeast, A cross B is going to point in the direction of the thumb as the fingers curl from A to B. So in this case, it's going to point out of the board. On the other hand, in the other example over here, we are taking B cross A. And so as the fingers curl from B to A, the thumb points into the board. And that is what is indicated over here. So B cross A points into the board. In particular, we see that A cross B is equal to minus B cross A. So this product, this vector product, is not commutative. Yeah, in general, it's not commutative. Unlike the scalar product, which was commutative. That is, the order does matter. Another elementary property is that A cross A is 0 because the sign of the angle between a vector and itself is simply 0. So the cross product of a vector with itself is 0. And when I say 0, I should be clear, it is the 0 vector. I have been a bit imprecise about that. Yeah. We did point out last time that there is a difference between the scalar 0, which is a point on the real line, and the vector 0, which is at the origin of your vector space. Okay. Now, let us give one more example of a vector in physics. Sorry, an example of the cross product in physics. We have the concept of the torque due to a force F acting on a particle. So suppose the particle is located at a position R with respect to some origin. So you have a particle which is located here, and we will designate its location by the vector R relative to some chosen origin. It's very important to note that there is an origin, which is the 0 vector, which has been prescribed. We have chosen it. Without a choice of origin, the concept of torque is not defined. Now, suppose the particle is acted upon by some force. Now, the force may point in some direction, designate it this way. Then we define the concept of the torque of the force F on the particle R with respect to the origin O. Okay, so you need all these pieces of data. You need an origin, you need a force, you need a particle's location. Then you define the torque. The torque denoted tau here is a vector which points, is defined as R cross F. So you're supposed to take your fingers first in the direction of R and curl them towards the direction of F, and then your thumb will point in the direction of the cross product. So please tell me, in this case, which way does the cross product point?
Into the plane.
Correct. So it points into the plane. So tau is into the plane, and I shall designate that by a circle with a cross inside it. Yeah, because I can't draw a vector into the plane. So that's how sometimes we designate it. Okay, I mean, right now we are simply giving some mathematical background and illustrating with some physical examples. The significance of torque and its utility will be discussed later on. It is a particularly useful. Oh, by the way, let me ask, when is the torque? Can you give me some instance when the torque of a force on this particle would vanish?
When the force is in the same direction of the radius vector.
Very good. Yeah. So if the force, is either in the direction of R or the direction opposite to R. Very good. Yes. If force is along the radius vector or the negative of the radius vector, then the torque vanishes. Yeah. And this will be a nice observation because there are very interesting forces where the torque vanishes. And that has interesting consequences. Okay. Now, we have another example of the use of the cross product. This is a geometric use. Suppose you have a parallelogram spanned by two vectors, A and B. Yeah. Now, by that I mean you draw the vectors A and B, and then you draw the two other parallel sides of the parallelogram, parallel to A and parallel to B, through the endpoints of A and B, join them at this end. Yeah, and that is my parallelogram spanned by A and B. Then the area of this parallelogram, I claim, is equal to the magnitude of the cross product. All right. So now I will leave this as an exercise for you to check you need some definition of you need some formula for the area. And then you would be able to check this. So, okay, now I see there is a question from Shakti Chauhan. Why is work done by a force acting perpendicular to object is 0? I know it's mathematically understood, but what's the basic idea behind it? Okay, all right, we will, okay, see, it's not, okay, interesting question. See, we have defined the work in this manner. Now you can ask, is this a good definition or is it a bad definition? Is it a useful definition or is it not? And does it correspond to the energy expended by a person who is exerting the force, right? So that is an appropriate question you can ask. Somebody is exerting a force, and do they feel that they have done some work? Yeah, I mean, you will have to measure this in some manner. And if they have transferred some energy to the particle, then you will say, okay, some work has been done. Now, what is found is that when the force is acting perpendicular to the direction in which the particle is displaced, then no energy is transferred. There is no work done. All right. So it is for this reason that such a definition is given. Yeah, so that is what I would like to say at present.
Sir, how do we know that no energy is transferred to the object?
Yeah, so you need to you have to come well fed. Yeah, you have to have a good breakfast and come, and then see how many calories you have lost in this process. Yeah, so it's something like that, very much so. So you need some way of measuring how much energy somebody has lost. Now it's a good question, how will you do that measurement and so on, but there is a procedure to do that. All right, so so your question is well taken, but my answer is that there are ways to measure these things, and then it's possible to show that no energy has been transferred. Yes, so Shubh Sharma says that it causes circular motion, only changes direction and not the velocity, right? Yeah, that's right. So when a particles, yeah. So let me be more precise about this shortly. We are going to talk about circular motion. So I request you to just hang on. We will come to this shortly. Yeah, but you are in the right direction, that in circular motion, it is often the case, something like this is happening. But I'd like to be more precise as we go along. Okay, so, and we will talk about circular motion soon enough. Okay, any other questions at this stage? But you are right that Aninda Bilavada has said that it does change velocity though. Yes, yeah. So the speed may not change, the velocity may change. So there are all these things. So yeah, I'd like to be a bit more precise when we come to it, because I've not yet talked about circular motion. Let's just get to that shortly. Anyway, I'm glad you are all offering these nice suggestions to each other and to me. Okay, a very good question. Somebody, Shakti Chauhan asks, can the area be B cross A as well? Why A cross B only? Well, actually, I said that it is the cross product magnitude thereof. So you are quite right that the area is also given by B cross A in magnitude. So you are quite right. Yeah, so however, there is a somewhat deeper idea here also, that maybe you want to give an orientation to the parallelogram. Yeah, that you want, some people would like to say that the parallelogram spanned by A and B is not the same as the parallelogram spanned by B and A. In particular, perhaps one would like to think of the parallelogram spanned by A and B. Okay, I have a little problem with my hand, which keeps touching something or other. Yeah, so it may be useful in some contexts to assign a direction to the area, yeah, not just a magnitude. So for instance, we may like to say that the area also has a sign or a direction, that the area itself is a vector, and the area of the parallelogram spanned by A and B is a vector pointing in the direction of the cross product A cross B, while the area of the parallelogram spanned by B and A is equal to the cross product B cross A. So that is a very useful concept. I have not used it here, but in that context, it does depend on which way you do it. Yeah, so I don't depend on the observer, not quite on the observer. I would use the term orientation. Is the parallelogram oriented? See, if you have a surface, you can talk about its orientation, up and down. All right, in this parallelogram, you have got the upper part and the lower part, and the choice of that is called a choice of orientation, and A cross B and B cross A correspond to the two different orientations. I think that's a slightly more precise way of putting it. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now I want to go to another interesting concept. We are now leaving our beloved cross product behind. And I want to speak about linear combinations. So suppose you have a pair of vectors, U and V. All right, a pair of vectors U and V. Then, and I have a pair of scalars alpha and beta, namely real numbers. Then I can form the product alpha U and the product beta V and take their sum. Right? So alpha U plus beta V. So this is called a linear combination of the vectors U and V, where alpha and beta are real numbers. So this is what we mean by a linear combination. Of course, you can take linear combinations of three vectors, just repeat this UV and then add a W in with some coefficient gamma. So you can have alpha U plus beta V plus gamma W. All right. So, and you can keep doing this. And so this is a very useful concept. That's because vectors can be added and they can be multiplied by scalars. So now we are making use of that feature. Now, in this context, we have the concept of linear dependence and linear independence. So let me talk about linear dependence first. Two vectors, U and V, are linearly dependent, all right, if one can be expressed as a multiple of the other. Okay, so let's make it simple. If U and V are multiples of each other, that is, if they point in the same direction or in opposite directions, then we will say that they are dependent. All right. So in other words, if U is a multiple of V, U is equal to alpha V for some real number, or if V is beta U for some real number, I mean, we admit either of these possibilities, for some real numbers, alpha and beta, then we will say that U and V are dependent. There is a reason I wrote both of these. Only one has to be true. All right. The reason is that alpha could be 0. All right. So even if U is equal to 0 times V, we will still accept that they are linearly dependent. All right. And in Debashish Bishwal has entered. So could you admit him? Yeah, so it could be that you have a formula U equal to alpha V, but no formula V equal to beta U, because that's the case here. We cannot divide by 0 and take this 0 there. All right, so there is no formula saying V equal to beta U. You only have the opposite direction. Okay, so that is why we need to have one or the other of the two. And in many cases, if say U is equal to 2V, then you also have V is equal to 1/2 U. Okay, so in those cases, there you have both formulae. But in the exceptional cases where the coefficient is 0, you have only one. Okay, so the geometric picture of two dependent vectors is this: U and V point opposite to each other or in the same direction. All right, there's a common origin, of course. Okay, so coming back here, let us observe that if U and V are dependent, then we observe that there is a linear combination that vanishes. So this is a very useful observation. Simply by taking this formula u equal to alpha v and bringing it to the left-hand side, we find that u minus alpha v is equal to 0, if there is such a relation, or v minus beta u is equal to 0. Okay, so we started by saying that two vectors are dependent, they point in the same direction. Now we have reformulated that geometric idea in an algebraic manner by saying that they are dependent if there is a linear combination that vanishes. All right. So this is going to be our strategy a lot of the time. We will take some physical insight or some geometric insight or some picture, write a formula, reinterpret it algebraically, and then define it through algebra. So we will often do such things. Okay, so now, so that is as far as linear dependence is concerned. We can also define the concept of linear independence. So again, let us start with geometry, a picture. We will say that u and v are linearly independent if they point in different directions. Okay, so that is they are neither parallel nor anti-parallel. Okay, so this u and this v are evidently linearly independent. Okay, so this is linearly independent. So can you tell me, in terms of the cross product, can you characterize linear independence of two vectors?
Non-zero.
Once again, please.
Sir, a non-zero cross product.
Correct. So u and v are linearly independent if u cross v is not equal to 0. Okay. Now u cross v can be 0 for many reasons. Right. So tell me some reasons why u cross v can be 0.
When either of u or v has magnitude 0.
Correct. It can happen if any vector is either of the vectors has 0 magnitude, then the cross product is 0. All right. So that is one option. What is the other option?
They're parallel or anti-parallel.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
So they may be parallel or anti-parallel.
Correct. The angle between them may be 0 or 180 degrees. Exactly. Yeah. So in both circumstances, the cross product will vanish. And in both cases, we will say that they are linearly dependent. All right. Because in particular, the 0 vector and any other vector are always considered linearly dependent. 0 vector is linearly dependent. 0 vector and any other vector are linearly dependent. Okay, because 0 vector doesn't have any direction, or it has all directions. Now u also has some designated direction, u, and then suppose you have a 0 vector. So you can say they point in the same direction. Or you can say that u is equal to 0 times the 0 vector. I'm sorry. The 0 vector is equal to 0 times u. Okay, so you got a linear relation between the two, namely 0 minus 0 times u equal to 0. All right. I hope I didn't go fast with that. Okay. So 0 times u minus the 0 vector vanishes. All right. So in that sense. Okay, I'm sorry, I have received some question. Anek to everyone, not a doubt. Why is the time constant as 9:41 a.m.? Oh, okay. It's possible that my okay. It's possible that my machine is slept off a little bit. Okay, anyway, thanks for pointing it out. I will mend that when the time comes. It was trying to update itself. Perhaps it got stuck somewhere. Sir is on a closed time-like curve. Goodness. Okay, you all have a sense of humor, or at least, okay, fine. Okay, so don't go by this time. It is now 12:22 p.m. Okay, so here was our idea about linear dependence of a pair of vectors. Now, more generally, we are going to give an algebraic definition of what we mean by linear independence of a collection of vectors. And it's going to be defined in terms of linear combinations. So vectors v1, v2, v3, any number of them. Yeah, a collection of vectors v1 through vn, n vectors, let us say, are said to be linearly independent if the only linear combination, namely c1 v1 plus c2 v2 plus c3 v3 plus ... that vanishes is the one where all the coefficients are 0. Okay. So it may take a moment to absorb this definition, but it is quite reasonable. If you go back and think about u and v, all right, there is any linear combination of u and v in this picture is going to be non-zero, I claim, unless the coefficients are both 0. All right. So I
So I have a question.
Yes, please.
So for this linear independence,
yeah.
So is that impossible for more than 3 vectors, at least in 3D?
Yeah, in 3-dimensional space, a good point. In 3-dimensional space, you cannot have more than 3 vectors that are linearly independent. Correct. So very right. You can have 2 that are linearly independent. You can have 3 that are linearly independent, but not 4. But that doesn't mean that any 3 vectors are linearly independent. You have to choose them somewhat carefully, or at least you can't choose them at random and not at random, but some choices will lead to linearly dependent triples. Okay. Any other question about this? Yeah. Isn't that true for n dimensions, that we can have at most n linearly independent vectors? Yes, Aditi asks. Yes, that is quite right. In n dimensions, in n-dimensional vector space, we can have at most n linearly independent vectors. Correct. So in 3D, at most 3 linearly independent vectors. All right. Okay. Okay, fine. So let us now proceed to, so far we have not talked about axes and coordinates very much. So let us introduce these things. The Cartesian axis, which we are going to now define, a very useful concept, goes back to René Descartes. Yeah, so given a choice of 3 mutually perpendicular Cartesian axes. So this is something I hope you are familiar with. If you have 3 fingers in your left hand, the thumb, the pointing finger, and the middle finger, they can be held in such a way that they point in mutually orthogonal directions, and you suppose they all emanate from the same origin, then they define such a triad. So we have these 3 axes, x, y, and z. And along each of them, we are going to define the unit vectors x hat, y hat, and z hat, namely the unit vectors in these 3 directions. They are called x hat, y hat, z hat, and some people prefer to call them I, j, and k. I will largely use x hat, y hat, j hat to avoid too many symbols, new symbols, because IJK may be doing other duties. All right. So this is the idea of Cartesian axis, three mutually perpendicular axes in R3 emanating from the origin. Yeah. So, okay, there is some question. Debashish Bishwal and Anand Balivada. Okay, no PHP will get a contradiction if you suppose there are more than n linearly independent vectors. Yeah. If you assume that there are more than n linearly independent vectors, it's possible to show that you will arrive at a contradiction. So, sure. Yeah. In any case, yeah, okay, we can talk more about this. And okay, yeah, so now let me come to the concept of the handedness of orthonormal set. So okay, I didn't say that, but I should have. These we are going to introduce the concept of a Cartesian orthonormal basis, all right, for the Euclidean vector space, three-dimensional vector space. By a Cartesian orthonormal basis, we mean the three vectors that are orthonormal, that is, they are perpendicular, mutually perpendicular, and of unit length. So in this case, they are mutually perpendicular if their dot products all vanish. Okay, so this is use of the dot product to check orthogonality. So x dot y must be 0. This will say that x and y are perpendicular. Y dot z is 0, and z dot x must also be 0. Of course, one could say that x dot z must also be 0, the unit vectors, yeah, and so on. So this is orthogonality, mutually orthogonal, and then also of unit norm. Okay, so x dot x, y dot y, and z dot z must all be equal to 1, so that their lengths will also be equal to 1. I mean, the length is the square root of the dot product. So the length of the vector x hat is equal to the square root of x hat dot x hat. Yeah, in which case it is 1. Okay, so yes, please.
So what is a norm? Can you please explain?
Okay, I have not defined a norm, but a norm is a notion of length. It has some properties that you may want it to satisfy. I am not spending time on that, but okay, let me just say what I will mean by the norm of x. Sometimes given a vector x, or let me not use x, let me take a vector v. We will define the norm squared of v to be v dot v. Okay, so this is the definition of our norm, or the square of the norm of a vector. It is the dot product of the vector with itself, and the norm of the vector will be defined as the positive square root. So v dot v. Okay, so this is called the norm, and this is the norm of v, and we want to have the idea that the norm of v is like the length. Yeah, I mean, it is the length. I mean, it gives you a notion of length. So in particular, the norm of a vector v is greater than or equal to 0. There is basically only one vector which has 0 norm, and that's the 0 vector. That's 0 norm. Okay. So in particular, x hat has norm 1. So an orthonormal set of vectors are a bunch of vectors, each of which has unit length, unit norm, and whose inner products all vanish. Okay. So x, y, x hat, y hat, and z hat are an excellent example of this. Now, we introduced the concept of a right-handed frame. So x hat, y hat, z hat form a Cartesian frame, right? An orthonormal Cartesian frame. The word frame is used, and we will say that this frame is right-handed if x cross y is equal to z. X cross y is equal to z. Yeah. Okay. Now, this may or may not happen. So it is something to be checked. So I've drawn two pictures here. In the first picture, which is a copy of the previous picture, yeah, X is towards roughly Malay, the Lakshadweep, and Y is towards Andamans, and then Z is towards Delhi. At least I am thinking of it from Chennai, well, roughly speaking. And in this case, X cross Y points upwards as the fingers curl, the thumb points upwards, X cross Y is Z. And so we will designate this as a right-handed frame. On the other hand, in the other example here, X is in the same direction, but Y and Z have been reversed. And you notice that X cross Y is going to point leftwards. X cross Y points leftwards, X hat cross Y hat points leftwards in the direction opposite to Z. And therefore, we will designate this as a left-handed frame or not a right-handed frame. So this is a left-handed. All right. So as a convention, we will work with right-handed frames. And that will be very helpful. Okay. Of course, you are welcome to find out what Y cross Z is, Y hat cross Z hat. What is Y hat cross Z hat, by the way? Can you tell me from this figure?
Minus X hat.
I have heard both answers. So what is the one?
In the
you want?
first picture, it is X cap.
Oh, thank you. Yes, in the right-handed frame, we have to be clear in which case. Thank you. So in the first picture, so we will from now on concentrate on the right-handed frame. And you are quite right that Y cross Z is equal to X hat. Yeah, from Y to Z, the thumb points towards X, and Z cross X in this case points towards Y. Okay, you will notice that there is a cyclic ordering to this. If you think of X, Y, and Z as ordered in this manner, then X cross Y is equal to Z. I'm omitting the hats. Yeah, and then you can cyclically permute them. That is, you replace X by Y, and then Y by Z. Y cross Z is then going to be the next one after Z. Okay, which is X. So sometimes you write it in a figure, X to Y to Z. Yeah, X, Y, Z in this circular permutation order. Okay. Any question about this? How we got? Okay. Okay. So now we come to the idea of a basis for the vector space. So we will say that X hat, Y hat, and Z hat, these are 3 unit vectors for us, form a basis for R3, for the 3-dimensional vector space we have been talking about. So I claim that they do form a basis. I'm going through this example. And the sense in which they form a basis is that, first of all, they are linearly independent. All right. Because I mean, from the picture, it is evident that they are linearly independent. But also, if you try to find any linear combination that vanishes, you will find that all the coefficients have to be 0. Okay, so X, Y, and Z are linearly independent. And to be a basis, it's not enough for them to be linearly independent. It must also be true that any vector must be expressible as a linear combination of the 3. All right. One can show that if it is possible to express any vector as a linear combination, then that linear combination is unique. Okay. So here we are. Any vector A can be written as a linear combination of these 3 mutually perpendicular unit vectors, and the coefficients AX, AY, and AZ have simple geometric meanings. All right, and this is possible for any vector. So I will show this using a picture. So suppose we have this right-handed frame, X, Y, and Z. So usually I think of X and Y as defining some kind of horizontal plane and Z as going upwards. All right, so this is a convenient convention and makes it easy to draw. And suppose I have a vector A here, then these coefficients AX, AY, and AZ are basically the orthogonal projections of A on the 3 coordinate axes. All right. So there's going to be some projection here, some projection there, and some projection onto the x-axis as well. I mean, it's a bit hard for me to draw in this little space, but AX, AY, and AZ are numerically given by A dot X hat, A dot Y hat, and A dot Z hat. In fact, it is not hard to check that. Suppose you take this formula number 3, and take the dot product of both sides with X hat. All right, let's do that. If I take the dot product of both sides with X hat, then A dot X hat is the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, what is the first term? AX times X hat dot X hat, which is simply AX. Yeah. And then the other two terms, what is their fate?
Becomes 0.
They're both 0 because Y hat dot X, excellent. So they're both 0 because Y hat is orthogonal to X hat and Z hat is orthogonal to X hat. So AY times Y hat dot X hat, which is 0, and AZ times Z hat dot X hat, which is also 0. Okay. So here we are. We do notice that AX is the component of okay, I'm again being a bit clumsy with my terminology. I should not have said projections, I should have said components. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So AX is the component of A in the direction of X hat, and so on.
So actually, aren't they the same? I mean, the projections and the.
Okay, yeah. So it's somewhat becoming a matter of semantics. I have, for better or worse, defined the projection as a vector and the component as a real number. And in keeping with that definition, I have to keep this distinction in mind. So no, I actually, that is the convention, and the projection is a vector, and I am simply wrong to say that AX is a vector. It's not the projection. But on the other hand, the first term, AX X hat, is indeed the projection of A in the X direction. All right, so there's no problem with that. So let me write that here. AX X hat is the projection along X hat of the A vector. Yeah, projection of A along X hat. Okay, so I hope, does that clarify the question for you? And AX is the component of A along X hat. Okay, so this is the distinction. It's a small distinction, but worth keeping in mind. Any question about this? Yeah, so it's a little bit easier in 2 dimensions. Suppose we are in the 2-dimensional Euclidean plane and R2, then a vector A can easily be, we say that we are resolving A into its components, namely AX and AY. You drop a perpendicular to each of the coordinate axes and the point of intersection that defines the component. Okay. Now, as a little exercise, which I'm not going to do here, I will let you find the Cartesian components of the cross product A cross B. So suppose A is equal to AX X hat plus AY Y hat plus AZ Z hat. Yeah, and similar B is written in terms of its components, BX, BY, BZ. Now I invite you to multiply A cross B and find what the components are. So you're supposed to find A cross B, the X component, A cross B, the Y component, and A cross B, the Z component. So I will leave it as an exercise for you to do precisely that. Okay, and the resulting formulae are quite nice, and you should see the patterns that emerge. Okay, so much for some generalities about dot and cross products and vectors. Let me now talk about the position coordinates of a particle, its velocity and the acceleration. Okay, so this is bringing in a little bit more physical input Okay. Now, let us again suppose we have a particle moving in this three-dimensional Euclidean space that we have been discussing all this while. And now we have a particle that's moving around. Now, at a given instant of time, we have the instantaneous location of the particle. All right. The instantaneous location of the particle can be specified by its Cartesian coordinates at that time. Okay, so it is somewhere at that point, has a certain address. That address can be specified using the Cartesian coordinates of that point. Of course, this depends on the choice of coordinate system. I may orient it in this way. You may prefer to orient your axis in some other oblique way. Yeah, you may choose a left-handed frame. I may choose right-handed. But so we have to say that. Yeah. So the components, the Cartesian coordinates, the Cartesian coordinates depend on the choice of frame. Okay, so that is worth keeping in mind. But the physical location is well defined, independent of the frame. So the physical location does not depend on the frame or choice of axis. Yeah, this is an important point. The location of Jupiter is a physical fact. My location is a physical fact. I can tell that I am 10 meters from that tree in this direction. All right. So these things can be specified using other physical objects. But if you want to tell my location using Cartesian coordinates, you have to choose a coordinate system. All right. Okay. So bearing that in mind, the coordinates of a particle, the location of a particle, will of course change with time. So we fix our frame. We are not going to change it. We fix our frame. And now X, Y, and Z are going to change with time. So they are now functions of time. And the particle is tracing out a curve in this space. This curve, it's a directed curve because as time flows, it goes in a particular direction. So it's a directed curve. Yeah. It's a parametrized curve as well because there's a parameter time along it. So here's my curve. At T0, it is here. At T1, it is there. At T2, it is somewhere else. Okay. So that is the sense in which it's a parametrized curve. There's a parameter time along it. Furthermore, it's a directed curve. That is, it is going in a particular way, not in the opposite way. So this curve, this directed parameterized curve, parameterized by time, is called its trajectory. So trajectory is a very important physical concept associated with the motion of a particle. Okay, so it is the curves traced by the particle in time. Now, what made it move, what the forces in operation are, who is watching it, all that is beside the point. The curve traced by the particle is called the trajectory. Now, the location of the particle given by these three numbers, x of t, y of t, z of t, can be turned into a vector. All right, it can be turned into a vector. The vector that points from the origin of the Cartesian coordinates. So see, you have chosen some coordinate system, so it has an origin. From that origin, you erect a vector to the current location of the particle. So the vector that points from the origin of Cartesian coordinates to the instantaneous position of the particle has these components, x, y, and z. And that vector, which I have drawn here, that vector is called the position vector of the particle at that instant of time and is denoted r of t. Okay. So r of t is called the position vector at time t. Okay. Now there's a question from Anant Bansal. Isn't every curve directed? No, unfortunately not. Let me take a wire, a metal wire. I just have it here. It is a curve. I'm holding it in the room. It is not directed. Okay? So not every curve is directed. I have a ring here. I have a circle here made with my fingers. There is no sense in which it is directed. Okay? You need additional information to tell whether it is directed or not. It's x of t, right, and not x of y. Oh, I'm very sorry. This is not x of y, it is x of t. Thanks for pointing that out. Akash Yadav has spotted an error. Thank you so much. Yeah, so not all curves are directed. There has to be a sense of direction to talk about a directed curve. And here that sense of direction is given by the increasing time. Unfortunately, my clock is stuck still at 9:41. I am not able to change that. At least I am not making any attempt to do so. Time has stood still. Okay, so okay, but besides those jokes, yeah, I do. I'm happy that you're paying careful attention. The concept of a trajectory has many things to do with it. It is a curve which is parameterized and it is directed. So all these things come along. And now we are even assigning some kind of vector to the instantaneous location of the particle. However, this has its uses and also its drawbacks. So while such a designation is convenient for some purposes, that is, to think of the location of the particle as a vector is sometimes convenient, but we must realize that that is physically the location of the particle is not given by a vector. The reason is that, let me say this slowly, it is important to bear in mind that the location of a particle is not really a vector physically, because it is not physically associated to a direction. In particular, the location of the particle does not come with any intrinsic notion of an origin. The particle is here. That is a physical concept. Jupiter is there. That's a physical concept. It does not refer to any origin. We set up a coordinate system, we choose an origin, and then we erect a vector from that origin to the location of Jupiter and say we have a position vector. It is very important to bear in mind that the position vector of a particle depends on an arbitrary choice of origin made by the observer.
Is it somehow connected to the affine spaces, and that is translation forms a vector space of which, like, position is the points of the affine space and the translation?
No, I wouldn't quite say that.
It forms a vector space.
Okay, you are drawing an analogy. It is true the affine space sort of doesn't have an origin, but I don't believe that is quite the right analogy. I would say it slightly differently. You have a space. In this case, we have taken it as a Euclidean space, happens to be a vector space or maybe even an affine space. But all these concepts are very, very special to the example we are looking at. In general, a particle could be moving on a sphere, right? Or even on a ring. Like, consider a particle moving on this ring. Now, this ring is neither a vector space nor an affine space. Yeah, okay, you may be able to give it some structure, but forget the ring, it is some ellipse or something, or a sphere or something. Yeah, so these spaces are not necessarily vector spaces, affine spaces, or any other such thing. Yeah, and
no, we are working in R3, which is a
okay,
R3 particularly, and whose displacement with respect to coordinate space gives R3.
Okay,
and we are just defining the trajectory is constraining its motion to whether it's a sphere or whether it's a ring. Whatever.
Okay. No. See, okay. Okay. If you want a quick answer, the answer is no. You have a reasonable analogy to make some analogy with affine versus vector space, but that is not quite the correct physical analogy. And the reason is that that analogy works or is useful only in one very specific context. In general, particles may be moving on spaces that are not thought of as embedded in 3-dimensional space or 4-dimensional space or any such thing. A particle may simply be moving on some complicated wire. The presence of that wire in some other space is not relevant at all. it is so you will see when I define the velocity, the sense in which the velocity of a particle comes with its own physical origin. Okay, this is the main distinction. The location of a particle does not define any direction, it does not define an origin, but the velocity of a particle will define its own origin, it will define its own direction. Now, the correct analogy is not with affine spaces as opposed to vector spaces, etc. The correct analogy is with a manifold and the tangent space to a manifold. Now, these are not concepts that perhaps we need now or have been defined or are familiar to everyone, so I am avoiding it. But suffice it to say that the coordinates or the location of a particle is a point on a space which one calls a manifold in mathematics, and the points on a manifold are whereas tangent vectors to a manifold are vectors. So this is the correct analogy, or at least the useful analogy. Okay. Now, let me say one more thing. Yeah, just to clarify this matter about the coordinates of a particle being dependent on the frame chosen. Now, CMI or any home or any office has an address, right? It may be, the address may be H1 Sipcot IT Park, yeah, Siruseri, pin code, zip code, 6 lakh something, Chennai, Tamil Nadu, etc. Yeah, so this is like but this address depends on a certain coordinate system. Yeah, we have made some agreement that we are going to call this area Siruseri, and we are going to call this road the first main road, and we are going to call this H1. Now, somebody else may have a different coordinate system. Indeed, 50 years ago, this place had no first main road. It was designated in a different way. It was called the rice field or the swamp, which was adjacent to a river, which was adjacent to the Siruseri village. Right, so that's the point. The coordinates of a particle, a particle's location is physically well defined, even though its coordinates depend on the choice of frame. In fact, this is an issue we face all the time in India. Yeah, like houses in many streets are called old number 50, new number 44. All right, so the coordinate system has changed over time. So in the old coordinate system, it was 50, new coordinate system, it is 44, right? And sadly, we have to keep both because we are unwilling to give up one and take the other, or we continue to use both. So that's the point. The coordinate system is simply an address, and it depends on the frame chosen. Okay. Any question about this matter? Vector quantities are relevant only when observer is there. Shakti Chauhan asks, no, I wouldn't go so far as saying that. No. See, a vector, as I defined, is a quantity that has a direction and a length and such things. Now, the location of a particle, unfortunately, doesn't have any direction. So that is why it is not a vector. It is not so much to do with whether there is an observer or not. Even to talk about the location of a particle, you do need some kind of observer. You need some coordinate system. You need some frame to talk about it. So yeah, it's not too much to do with whether there is an observer or not. The distinction between vector and coordinates of a location do not have so much to do with an observer presence. Okay. Yeah, anyway, I'm very happy with all your interesting questions and comments. Okay, now we come to the next concept. We have talked about the location of a particle, the instantaneous location of a particle. But the particle is not always present there. It is moving. It's moving along its trajectory. Now we can ask, how does it move along the trajectory? Now we can talk about what happens over a very short interval of time. That is called the infinitesimal displacement of the particle. Okay. So suppose you are at time t, and then you consider a nearby time t plus delta t, where delta t is small, then you can ask how the coordinates of the particle x, y, and z change over that small instant of time. Okay. Now, so we can ask how the particle has moved in that short instant of time. You take the difference between the coordinates x of t plus delta t minus x of t, y of t plus t delta t minus y of t, and z of t plus delta t minus z of t. So those are three real numbers. And they will form the triple consisting of these three differences. This is called the infinitesimal displacement in the x direction. X of t plus delta t minus x of t is called the infinitesimal x displacement, infinitesimal y displacement, and infinitesimal z displacement. Okay, so you assemble the three together as a triple that defines a certain vector, which I'm going to define. That is called the displacement vector. This is the infinitesimal displacement vector. Now, why is this a vector? Okay. So I hope this will clarify things a little bit. The concept of infinitesimal displacement by its very nature defines an origin. Now, what is this origin? It is the original location of the particle, the initial location of the particle. So let's draw a picture here. We have a particle moving along this trajectory. It is originally located at r of t. It has moved in a small instant of time to some r of t plus delta t. Okay. Now the displacement vector or the infinitesimal displacement vector is simply the vector pointing from r of t to r of t plus delta t. Okay. So the original location of the particle is to be considered as the origin. Okay. Now this is a physically defined origin. It is independent of what the origin of the coordinate frame may have been. That origin is elsewhere, somewhere else. Okay. That has no relevance to the physics of the infinitesimal displacement. Okay, so the origin of coordinate system was arbitrarily chosen. So the arbitrary origin of the coordinate system has no relevance to the displacement vector. The displacement vector is located or emanates from the initial location of the particle. So here you see how physically a vector is defined. The concept itself gives itself an origin, and the concept itself gives itself a direction, namely from the initial location to the final location. So no such thing happened in the case of the location of a particle, right? The location of the particle did not tell you what the origin was, and it didn't give you any direction. Okay, so when we say infinitesimal, we mean over a very short time. So this is a very small vector. It can be made arbitrarily small. Okay, smaller than any number you prescribe. You will learn about infinitesimals in your analysis course, I presume. So this was a great development due to Cauchy, Weierstrass, and all the others. Now, using the concept of an infinitesimal displacement, we can define the concept of the velocity of a particle. So I must emphasize that these concepts took hundreds of years to develop. Calculus was invented and developed to understand physics, to understand particle motion, celestial mechanics, motion of planets, stars, and so on, like the sun or the moon. And it took a very long time to come to the conclusion of how to define the concept of instantaneous velocity. So we are only summarizing what has been developed over a long time. Such notions go back to antiquity, though they took very concrete shape in the work of Newton. But the concept of an instantaneous location and instantaneous direction of motion and those kind of concepts are there from much before. For instance, even in the work of Madhava, of Sangamagrama, of the Kerala School of Mathematics and Astronomy, such ideas are already present. But it is really in the time of Newton and his contemporaries when a very concrete formulation of these ideas was possible, and that is how calculus was invented. Now, now the velocity of a particle is defined as a certain difference quotient. So delta R, I have defined it as a difference, right? Delta R is a difference between the current location and the previous location. So let me write it here again. Delta R is equal to R of t plus delta t minus R of t. Okay, so that's a difference. And I call that delta R of t. And that difference is being divided by delta t, the time in which that happened. And then we take delta t to 0 so that this vector becomes shorter and shorter. Yeah. And in the limit where delta t goes to 0, we get some quantity, and that is called the velocity vector, v of t. So that velocity vector tangent is now tangent to the curve. It points tangent to the trajectory. Okay, so
Sir?
Yes, please.
No, I had a doubt about the origin. You said the origin is like the initial location of particle, right?
Precisely.
So if it's moving in a circle, what exactly would be the initial location?
See,
As in, like,
wait. We are defining the velocity at the instant t. So the origin changes with time.
Okay.
Okay, so I hope your question has been answered. At this point of time, let us say t1, and at this point of time t2, the origins of the velocity vector are different. At this point of time, we have the velocity vector pointing this way, and it has its own origin, which is physically defined as the location, current location of the particle. So this is v of t1. Okay, thank you. You are welcome. This one at time t2, you have some v of t2. So very good point. The origin moves with the particle insofar as the definition of the velocity is concerned. Insofar as definition of velocity. So that is why we keep saying the instantaneous velocity. See, there is no concept of origin for the velocity over long times. Yeah, that is, there are different origins, different velocity vectors. There is no such concept as a common origin. Okay. Yeah, so now using Newton's notation, which helped a lot, we will say that the velocity vector v of a particle is the time derivative of the position vector along the trajectory. So we already defined the position vector. And this, oh my, I am quite bad at this. Keep touching something I shouldn't touch. Yeah. Yeah. So, the velocity vector has three components. You remember the formula here: x of t plus delta t minus x of t divided by delta t. As delta t goes to 0 is simply the differential coefficient or the derivative of x with respect to time. So that is called x dot, then you have y dot and z dot. Okay, so you assemble the three into a vector. Yeah. Now, okay, so now we go back and forth. This velocity vector, as I have said, is a vector physically which emanates from the current location of the particle. But for some purposes, we will move that vector to the common origin that the coordinate system observer had set up. And that was called x hat, y hat, z hat. And we will put them together in that vector. All right. So I am going to make your head spin in this way. The velocity vector is really emanating from the current location, but for some purposes, it is helpful to move that vector parallel transport it, so to speak, to its original, to the origin of the coordinate system, and define a new vector x hat x dot x hat, y dot y hat plus z dot z hat. So, I mean, the question is this useful? Does it help in calculations? If it does, then we will accept it. When it stops being useful, we will throw it away. All right. So that is, so I should just remark here that we have moved velocity vector to the origin of coordinate frame for convenience in defining this formula. Here x hat, y hat, z hat are fixed basis vectors, okay, that had been chosen by the observer. Particle is moving here, particle is here instantaneously, there is some velocity vector. We will simply translate that down here and define this velocity vector. We will parallel translate it back to the origin of the coordinate system and designate that as the velocity vector at that instant for certain purposes. As you can see, this may have its limitations, and you are quite correct. Okay, but it has some use also. Okay, I have a question here, Sir Shakti Chauhan. Sir, definition of tangent is the line intersecting the curve at only that point, yes, but how can the velocity vector be tangent? Because if so happens, then how is it possible to measure the displacement, even the smallest one? Okay, I think your question is an attempt to grapple with the concept of an infinitesimal. So I congratulate you for trying to grapple with this. This is what it took several hundred years to figure out. So you are not alone in this. But if it helps at all, let me draw a picture. This is my curve. Yeah, what do you mean by a tangent? Okay, so I start by successive approximation. I start with a secant or a chord. Yeah, start with a chord between two separated points. Yeah, I define that as my first approximation to the tangent. Yeah, and I hope you will not object to that, because in mathematics, many things are defined through successive approximations or a limiting procedure. This is the lesson from analysis and the development of mechanics and physics. So this is my first approximation to the tangent vector. I mean, you can extend it both ways if you like. And then you take the next approximation. You bring the final point a little bit closer. The direction would change a little bit. It would still be some kind of chord. And you keep doing that. You keep doing that. And the question is, does the process have some definite limit or not? Now, it may not have any definite limit, but it may. In this case, it definitely does. I think your eyes will tell you that in the limiting case where this point reaches the original point, there is a definite direction to be identified, namely the tangent direction. Measure the displacement, even the smallest one.
So we can never reach to that single point now. Like if we have 2 points, we can always find a point between them.
Look. See, we are not simply moving that point here. We are doing two things. We are taking a ratio. We are computing a quotient. We're taking a numerator and a denominator. In the numerator also something is happening. Two things are getting very close to each other. All right. The numerator, we have this vector and that vector. The denominator, we have a delta t. So we are taking the difference of two vectors, dividing it by delta t, and we are asking, does this quotient have some limiting value? All right. And I think the picture tries to convey to you that it does. You could, of course, have a formula. Suppose someone gives you a formula of the velocity, maybe for circular motion or other type of motion. You can check, does this have some limiting value, using some tools from calculus. Okay. So I think, but your point is very well taken. It took really a very long time to understand this concept of infinitesimals and calculus and a quotient of two quantities, both of which are going to zero. All right. So so it's okay that to grapple with this, but I think during this semester you will learn a lot more about it, both in your calculus or analysis class as well as here in physics. Okay, so I'm actually out of time, 1:11 p.m. So I think we need to stop here. But are there any immediate questions at this time?
So I had a question. Okay, sir.
Yes, please. Could you
So
say your name also, because I can't see you. I don't know who is speaking.
yeah, so I'm Srimati. It's a Srimati Shri.
Srimati, fine. Yes, please.
So when you define the velocity, like
Yes.
instantaneous velocity with respect to like the moving origin, you've
Yes,
written
yes.
x dot plus y dot plus z dot, right? As in terms of the parameter t.
Yeah, you're talking about this formula
Yeah, and then
or the
you
previous one?
yeah, the previous one, the x
Yeah.
dot, yeah.
Correct,
And
correct,
then,
correct.
then you use the same x dot, y dot, and z dot with respect to components in the basis, right?
Original
I mean-
basis. Yeah. So this is cheating. There is no doubt about it. This is cheating. This is bad things to do. You should not even write such things. I accept your criticism completely, wholeheartedly. But having said all of that, it is actually quite useful. So I am doing it. Okay. So I agree with you that you feel like I have removed the chair from under your seat. But no, look, it is useful. There is a certain procedure we are following here. X dot, y dot, z dot are the instantaneous components of the velocity defined with respect to that moving origin. I mean, the origin is not moving. I mean, at that instant of time, there is a certain origin. At that origin, you compute all these things. You get a certain three numbers, x dot, y dot, z dot. They define a certain vector at that place. Okay, I think all that is acceptable to you. Now, I am doing something a little bit illegal now to take that vector which we had defined, and for my happiness and for your convenience, I am simply moving that vector to the origin of the common frame that some observers set up. Now, that last stage, if you don't like it, don't do it. Yeah, but it is not affecting the definition of velocity. It is
So
a
what
matter
does that convenience refers to? Like,
it is convenient because it will help us with some calculations, some mundane calculations, which we will do tomorrow, or next time. So, but no, look, sometimes it is helpful to see you got a bunch of vectors, each at different points of the trajectory, all right? But perhaps you want to compare them or you want to do something with them. Now, maybe it's helpful to move them all to a common origin and compare them over there. Okay, because so that's the point. For such purposes, it is helpful to move them. Now, there may be no way to do this, or the procedure to do this may require some kind of parallel transport, parallel translation. So you need that kind of procedure. If you have it, well and good. If you don't do this. Okay, but
No, but like when you even like when you do parallel transport, for the components to be the same, you're already assuming that at that origin.
No,
like
that is the definition of parallel transport. When I say parallel transport, it means okay, wait. See, X, Y, and Z were defined with respect to the original frame, fixed frame. See, the point, the origin was all that changed. You see, when I said that the velocity vector points from a particular origin, namely the current location of the particle, that only defined an origin. The X, Y, Z are all defined with respect to the original frame. That has not changed. That background is always present. So, I hope it is not as though the current location of the particle defines a frame here. No.
That was not
good. Okay, very good question you have asked. The current location of the particle only defines an origin, a location. It does not define a frame. Sorry. That original frame is the only one available to us, and we are going to resolve things with respect to that frame. Good question. Any other question?
Yes, the concept of hello. Yes, and the concept of
sorry, who is speaking?
Bijayan Rai.
Okay, fine. Bijayan Rai, yes.
Yes, the concept of infinitesimal isn't quite defined in standard analysis, right? Like it's like from like 1970s, it was Robinson's book that played an integral role in the non-standard analysis development, formalizing those hyperideas and maybe, I don't know, like not exactly. Yes, but in the realm of analysis, standard analysis, we try and formulate everything in terms of error terms, whose like when the quotient we are dividing by epsilon or whatever, we can 10 to 0 and that's getting z.
Okay, your point is well taken. But I would like to caution you a little bit. The concept of an infinitesimal is now more than 300 years old, if not more. It did not come from the 1970s. Euler discovered vast swaths of mathematics and physics using infinitesimals and other such ill-defined concepts and made enormous progress on whose feet we are standing. Yeah, so this point has to be made. A thing may be useful and reasonably defined for a certain generation of people who are then able to use it to derive astounding results. That same concept may be further defined in terms of yet more fundamental things in the 1970s. That does not mean that the concept of the infinitesimal is ill-defined. It is as much defined as the skill of the person whose hands it is in. And in the hands of Newton, and in the hands of Euler, and in the hands of D'Alembert and all these friends, they were able to deal with it. And we too can deal with it.
Sir, are there any such analogous things in the modern day, like which today people find to be reasonably defined, but are not like defined in the full rigor?
Absolutely. There are vast swaths of physics where we do certain what would be called formal operations, which are no doubt correct, but do not have a clear mathematical foundation or basis or axiomatic formulation. In such a situation, one cannot make the mistaken conclusion that the operations are wrong or the physical procedure is wrong. It is the opposite. The mathematics is behind the physics. We are waiting for the right mathematical framework to define such quantities. This is the way it has been in physics throughout. Very rarely has the mathematical framework already been in existence that can simply be used. Nature teaches us mathematics through physics.
Tell those as point those as notations, like in the previous example where we were finding the cross product, and that's also a formal way. That's the use of formal determinant, which is not quite rigorously defined. For the determinant is only defined over a field of values. And
but wait, I mean, this determinant, no, okay, I mean, I haven't written a determinant, but okay, I mean, see, again, I mean, determinants were fine for Gibbs and Heaviside and not to mention Maxwell and yeah. So, I mean, there are operational definition of what you mean by a determinant of a matrix or an array. So there can be more refined concepts of determinants that come later. Yeah, I mean, there the field is simply real numbers. So yeah, so I think one has to be a little bit accepting of a use of concepts, and mind you, the rigorous definition that you espouse today, after 10 years, may be considered as obsolete and replaced with a more rigorous, more axiomatic framework. All right. So let us be a little bit humble about this. As I said,
thank you.
Yeah, as I said, the value of these concepts largely depends on the skill of the practitioner and the access to deep physical insight. None of this is possible without deep physical knowledge of how the planet moves and what actually happens. Without that, there is no calculus. It is only by looking at that, making measurements and observing it, that we see that it is helpful to define a velocity. In particular, if you did not look at planets, but had the misfortune of studying pollen grains in water, you will never discover the concept of velocity, because the trajectory of a pollen grain is so jagged that you cannot define any such thing. Right? So the nature of the mathematical framework that is developed is very much dependent on the physical phenomena that you wish to describe. Okay, so there are a couple of questions here from Shakti Chauhan. So that means, sir, like whatever we are trying to do in physics is to reach to a certain approximation of a particular event. We are never reaching the exact thing, I guess. Yeah, in some sense, you're right. We are simply modeling nature. Now, the exact thing, as you say, is nature. And now we don't know what that is. We are simply trying to describe it and approximate what we see. Now, it is often the case that our mathematical models are not so accurate. Sometimes they are very accurate. sometimes so accurate that we can find no discrepancy. So the situation depends. But yeah, there is no such thing as exact in this context, because that is nature itself. Yeah, I mean, you can talk about, yeah, so I mean, this is simply a mathematical model. I mean, it's only as good as it agrees with nature. Yeah. Okay, I have gone a bit over time. Any other questions at this moment? Exactness is not quite defined, probably in natural sense. Okay, we can, Bijayan says something like that. Yeah, right, yeah. No, I mean, when one says exact, I think what you mean is that does it agree with the measurements, or how well does it agree? How accurately does it describe phenomena? Now, the more accurately, the more exact it is. That is all. Nature is our God. Now we have to see how well we can describe it or predict it. That is all. Okay, so perhaps on that note, I will wish you all a good lunch. And unless there is any urgent question now.
Actually,
yeah.
sir, I had a
Yeah.
quick question.
Sorry, who is speaking?
This is Anand.
Okay, yes.
It's about the books that you recommended. Like one of them, the book by David Morin.
Okay.
It has many problems of varying levels of difficulty. So I wanted to know, relative to his scale, how difficult can we expect the problems like you give us in the exams or the assignments to be?
I have no idea. You will get what you get. The discussion we are having has raised various questions and problems. They are the sorts of things, and you will get some problems. Look, I am not going to take problems out of Morin and dump them on your head.
No, that's not what I'm
So,
asking, sir. I'm just saying roughly the level of difficulty. That
yeah.
I'm not
Okay.
literally going to go mark the problems up.
Yeah. So I would not. Yeah. No, I mean, we are here to understand concepts and work out a few problems. No, my intention is not to make you experts at solving problems from Morin. No, not at all. I don't think I can solve most of the problems in Morin, for the simple reason that I've not even attempted a single one of them. So yeah, don't worry about it. You will get some problems that you can try it out.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I'm very happy with all of your enthusiastic questions and comments. Please enjoy your lunch. And we shall reconvene on Tuesday at 11:50 a.m. But you will hear from me in the